in fact, you make that a quick break for us. All right, so now we're going to move to talking about animals, which we will be doing for the rest of the day now. So our first presenter is going to be Dr. Lynn Hunsinger from UC Berkeley, and I've asked her to come and tell us a little bit about what we know about the history of grazing management in California. And this is going to be a grossly abbreviated presentation, just in terms of the whole history of all the interesting things that's been going on in the state over the last couple of years. So with that, Lynn, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Mark Finksy invited me to talk about the history of domestic grazing, but actually I got kind of excited, and it's pretty much to talk about the history of everything. Only the parts that I found interesting and sort of fun. So we'll see how it comes out. My first real job, by the way, was with Cal Fire. So I also wander up into the forest a little bit too. All right, so California grassland, painted in 1875 by Albert Bierstadt, a German painter. If you look at it today, oops, it was looking just a second ago.
It might have been flipped off. Check this, the left-hand side.
Oh, there, but it still looks a lot the same as it did when Albert Bierstadt painted his picture. But a great deal has happened, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that have happened. So the title is The Complicated History of California Rangeland Fire, the Plow, New Plants, Livestock, and Novel Ecosystems. So almost as lengthy as Van's different things. California is a state of change. Our state is really changing rapidly. Ever since European arrival, a bunch of things were set in motion that have caused rapid ecosystem change in California, and it's still ongoing. Things have been changing for 100, 200 years. That's really not very long for the kind of massive ecosystem change that the state has undergone. And I'd say that today we have a very hard time predicting the future or understanding exactly what kinds of changes are going on and what their implications are, but I'm going to give it a shot. Prior to European arrival in California, California had its own suite of large herbivores, including tule elk. There were probably around 500,000 tule elk in California. According to some estimates, there's about 6,000 now in about 22 herds, but they were reduced to about 28 back in the 19th century and rescued by a rancher who kept a few on his ranch and protected them. They were hunted for a lot of reasons, but when the Spanish came, they were very much there. And the Spanish set up a chain of missions and then forts or presidios, and then eventually ranchos or large ranches. And the legacy of the ranchos, one of them is that more than 80% of our oak woodlands and grasslands are privately owned today, which is pretty unique in the Western United States. So when the Spanish came, they saw something like this, maybe without the cows, but this is Spain. So the landscape, I like to think, how familiar was that? You know, oaks and grass, just like back in Spain and Portugal. And the Spanish brought, of course, the livestock to the Mediterranean region of California, which is this area, number one, which is where the oak woodlands and grasslands are, and where the climate is also like Spain or southern New York. It's a Mediterranean climate, long dry summers that can end any time with unpredictable rainfall and a cool season, growing season. Same in the Mediterranean basin. The ranchos that the Spanish and then the Mexican governments established were very much aligned along the coast with a little bit in the Central Valley. And that's something to remember, that influence was pretty much in the Mediterranean regions of the state and a bit up into the valley. This is a map from, I think, 1862, and I don't think you can read the words, but it says herds of wild cattle, wild horses, and elk roaming the Central Valley at this time. The livestock that the Spanish kept were basically quasi-free roaming and were rounded up when a ship came in and purchased the hides and tallow. So they were grazing pretty much like the elk and like the pronghorn that were common at the time throughout California. Not too many fences in those days. When the Spanish came, they brought a whole ecological package that I've been alluding to. They brought grasses, farming practices, and livestock that had coexisted together in the Fertile Crescent for about 6,000 years or more. So the grasses were very well adapted to livestock grazing and to cultivation, which is quite disturbing, as you can imagine, to the soil. First time the Spanish sailed into California was in 1542. The first settlement was in San Diego in 1769. And the Mediterranean grasses that they brought with them, with the livestock as ballast in ships and so on, dominate our grassland today. And that grassland is still changing. In California, why was it so susceptible to change? This is a 16th century map of California. We often talk about California as an island. We don't quite mean this. But in fact, the plants and animals of California were pretty isolated by mountains to the east and the north, the desert to the south, and the Pacific. So they evolved over and adapted over a very long time without livestock, without species from other parts of the world or even other parts of the continent here in California. So when these very aggressive, tough annual species from the Mediterranean came in, they had very few defenses, very few ways of coping with that in California. And plant invasions into California are still going on. As you, Vina fatua, wild oats, starting way back in the 18th century, all the way to the ones we love to talk about today, Medusa head, goat grass, and yellow star thistle, more recent arrivals. There will be more. There will be more. This is a very hard process to stop. And the grasslands have been changed pretty much irreparably. What was there before? What was the grassland like in the 18th century, in the early 19th century? Many people think that a lot of it had these native perennial bunch grasses on it, and that's likely, especially in moisture areas around the coast and moisture areas and the foothills. John Muir, describing the Central Valley in the 19th century when he grew up, talked about how it was just a sea of flowers or forests from mountain to mountain. And then in the summer, completely dried up and disappeared. It was just basically dried plants and dust. It doesn't sound that much like a bunch grassland in those dry valley areas, but we don't really know. We don't really know. We don't know how much of it changed by this time. But there is a growing idea that a lot of the drier areas were dominated by native forbs, which also means flowers. Today, many people term the California grassland a novel ecosystem. This is wild oats. This is an ungrazed, unused area of grassland that's completely dominated by wild oats. Now, we don't know, was this plowed at some time in the past? What went on here that enabled the complete conversion of this ecosystem? Was it simply the extreme competitiveness of these non-native grasses? The students in my class this year are planting native and non-native grasses in pots to look at how they'll grow, and I haven't told them that last year the natives didn't get around to germinating until after the end of the semester, and the annuals were like this tall. So they're different. They're different plants. They grow differently. And often we call this a novel ecosystem because we don't fully understand it. It's new. It's very hard to contemplate on any massive scale going back to some previous state. So we have to learn how to manage and take care of this ecosystem. And we have 100 years or so. To reiterate, with European contact, there are all kinds of introductions to this state in this ecological and social package. We had missions and ranchos, livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, European annual grasses common to the Mediterranean region. The big problem in my yard is South African belt grass, which comes from South Africa. Grasses from all over the Mediterranean region are here. Mediterranean regions of the world are here. And then they brought cultivation, which of course is profoundly disturbing to the soil, and the seeds that come when you buy a bag of seeds to plants or bring a bag of seeds to plants in a place. The changes include the reduction and suppression of coastal Native American populations. This affected indigenous activities, including burning. The Spanish outlawed native burning, and yet one thing the Spanish didn't understand, nor did the settlers that came after, was that the California ecosystem was in part created by Native American burning. The open forests, the oak woodlands, heavily influenced by frequent fire, and because it was frequent, of relatively low intensity or severity, and we'll confuse now about this terminology, but didn't burn that much, mostly this understory. And changing from free-roaming wild herbivores to quasi-free-roaming stock during this period. Hides and tallow industry, they were shipped to Spain and to the eastern United States and Europe. Doesn't require a particular kind of animal or an animal in particularly good condition. So it was mainly let them loose, monitor them a bit, try to keep them close to your property, but it wasn't absolutely necessary because everybody just returned everybody's stock, they were branded, and shipped the hides and tallow when the ships came in. Now the gold rush has its own little section here because it also brought some very profound changes to California, namely people in huge numbers from all over the world, not just the eastern United States. Mexican population came for gold rush, and was here actually already before, but, even Chinese people from southern China, people from all over the world came to get rich in the gold rush, and from the eastern United States, and that created a feeding problem. And so one of the ways that was addressed was by bringing livestock in from the rest of the United States. Lots of long cattle drives into California, bringing breeds more oriented toward meat production into the state for the growing gold rush market. And we can't exaggerate how many people came to the state during this time. And there are not very many romantic sheep drive paintings, so I'm having to do with this. I'm sorry, it's pretty cool, but also sheep. And during this time, when this population in the Sierra was really growing, transhumance began to be practiced. Transhumance was invented to describe what they do in Haiti, where they move the animals into the mountains in the winter and in the summer and bring them down in the winter. As animals were driven up to gold rush markets, that became more common as a practice, and it's really going to expand in the next period, post-gold rush period. Dairies were established up near Truckee and so on to graze mountain meadows after the gold rush. And in fact, after the gold rush was a period of huge agricultural growth. Gold rush game markets were huge. This is collecting eggs from the Farallon Islands. Down below, sea turtles brought in from the Galapagos Islands. But this had pretty powerful effects on our wildlife populations. As I mentioned earlier, reducing the Tule elk population almost to extinction, really reducing pronghorn population to the point where we don't have 22 herds of pronghorn today like we do elk. All of these things were served in restaurants, were served in hotels, even bear paw and other delectables from California wildlife, lots. So you have a reduction in native herbivorous or native grazing during this period of time as well. Now from statehood and beyond, from 1850 to 1900, there are also a lot of changes in the state. Hydraulic mining left a big legacy in the state, and mining in general created lots of canals, irrigation works, and hydraulic mining really changed the hydrology of a lot of areas in the state. And when agriculture started to develop, a lot of water was captured and used for irrigation, and that also had an impact. The rocks and stones and dirt from these mountains, of course, are still in our rivers over in the Sierra foothills, profound changes to the ecosystem. And of course, all along, we had cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers, agriculture starting to develop in the valleys, and so transhumance continued to grow and become very common during this period, the latter half of the 18th century. Especially as agriculture expanded into the valley, the best place to find green feed during the summer was up in the mountains. So there was more and more pressure to take animals up into the mountains. Here's a little map of, done by a German researcher of transhumance in Sacramento Valley, an annual migration of animals. Now, acreage, as I mentioned, increased a lot. Crop harvesting during the late 1800s and up into the early 1900s. One thing that happened during this period that a lot of people point to as occurrences that accelerated the rate of rangeland grassland change was there was a really huge flood in 1862. This is Sacramento, now Venice, during this flood, which reduced the amount of forage available for grazing and also drowned a lot of animals. And then in the next couple of years, there was a huge drought. I mean, this is California, right? Go figure. But that also reduced the amount of forage. And with all the animals brought in for the gold rush, when the gold rush ended, a lot of people left. And so there were a lot of leftover livestock left on the range. So you had some pretty high grazing pressures during this period because of the loss of forage during the flood and during the drought. Some people estimate that about 1 million animals, 1 million livestock perished in floods and droughts during the 1860s, and then that accelerated rangeland change too. So 1900 to the 1980s, I call this reducing grazing and fire. There's kind of an interesting difference here. In rangelands, the assumption was that they're managed for production, university extension, which got started during this period, mainly focused on helping people make their operations more standard and more profitable, but also helping with burning or the vegetation management activities, reducing brush, agricultural burning and so on were quite active during the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. But during this period, Native American life was further lost and suppressed. This is a Miwok home in the Yosemite Valley. And of course, I mentioned that low intensity fire was a common part of the scene for any number of reasons, making it easier to find acorns and other forest products, management of vegetation for the things that it was used for, which was many, clearing openings and meadows for big game because native populations hunted big game and so on. Fire was really an important part of life. And when John Muir came to the Sierra, he found a forest somewhat like this, and he called the Sierra the range of light because he could see through the trees for long distances, and you can see the fire scars on these trees. But as with the Spanish, Muir didn't appreciate that this was a created landscape that he was in. He considered it a wilderness and therefore needed to be protected from people, fire, grazing, everything that was going on at the time in the forest. And when the Forest Service was established in the early 20th century, a lot of these ideas were also shared by the Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot, the first chief, said there's no doubt that forest fires encourage a spirit of lawlessness and a disregard for property rights. So there was huge pressure on ranchers, Native Americans, agriculturalists, anybody doing burning at this time to stop. Bernard Fernhow was a Prussian forester. The whole fire question in the United States is one of bad habits and loose morals. So you know, fire guys. John Muir, of course, fire, the axe, and wholesale vandalism have long threatened the forests of the country with their utter destruction. And fires of the sheepmen form more than 90% of these fires. And he's talking about the interrelationship of grazing and fire. Sheep herders would bring sheep up into the mountains. They would graze during the summer, and they would set fires to reduce brush and expand the grazing. And some people talking about this, early people wandering around the Sierra at this time, say, gosh, there's not much brush or even grass below the height to which a sheep can reach. It's being sort of cleaned out by these animals, which is interesting to think of. When I was being trained as a range manager, this was considered a horrible situation. Now, in some ways, it could be appealing in some places. But John Muir didn't like it. He said one soldier in the woods, armed with authority and a gun, would be more effective in forest preservation than millions of signs. So it comes with a military attitude. And in fact, the military did come in and protect a lot of the forest reserves from grazers. During the war, fighting fire became conflated with patriotism. Setting fires was anti-American. The Forest Service also kicked off the first major advertising campaign by an agency using Smokey the Bear as a symbol. It started with Bambi and then it moved on to Smokey. And the only observation I have to make about Smokey is that he definitely works out now. Gotten incredibly buff over time. But as you know, I'm sure all of you know, fire suppression has put us in a bit of a pickle in some of our forest and brushlands. because of the buildup of fuels and fire and grazing. I wanted to point out, when people are talking about fire or grazing, fire and grazing goes together in some ways. You can have a fire and maintain the reduction in vegetation with grazing and so on. All these tools, mechanical, fire, goats, sheep, cattle, all of them belong being used together or being thought about as having potential for being used in various configurations rather than as one thing or another. Here's Yosemite National Park, late 19th century, just as an outcome of all this. You can see that this is Albert Bierstadt again. The bottom land is oak woodland. There were a lot of oaks down there. The national parks are trying to restore that. Meadows, you can see these magnificent landscapes very clearly from this kind of vegetation. Towards the turn of the century, you can see conifers invading the rangeland or the grassland at the bottom of the valley. And by now, it's almost pure conifers, and of course, some of them have suffered quite a lot from water stress. A student of mine looked at Shasta Trinity National Forest over time and how grazing had changed there, and got one of the people he interviewed shared some letters that they got because the stockmen used to burn to clear brush and to keep meadows open in the forest. And the forest supervisor calls them out and says, you know, you're making us fight these fires that you keep setting, and our men belong at the front, and therefore you are not being patriotic, which is a fairly sobering kind of letter to get. His diagram or graph of the amount of forage harvested, it's both a matter of shorter periods of time and fewer animals over time in that forest. It's pretty dramatic, and I don't think it's exceptional in California in terms of what actually has been removed in terms of biomass from a national forest over time in California. And overall, what we're seeing over time is, you know, this free roaming era of livestock grazing on vast woodlands and grasslands kind of giving way to grazing in California being restricted more and more to the foothill areas of the state, in between this burgeoning crop region and public lands in the mountains. Okay. And at that time, of course, until around the 80s, the assumption of outreach and research from cooperative extension and others was that the only important product from grazing is meat and fiber. That's the dominant product. And extension services, I think, really focused on that as a goal. And this has changed in the 80s pretty much. Today, in the 80s and beyond, I call this the multifunctional grazing management. And actually, ranchers have always done multifunctional grazing management, but it took the rest of us a long time to catch on. And an interest in bringing grazing and fire back as more emphasis is placed on grazing for biodiversity, fire hazard reduction, and control of endangered species, restoration and regeneration. It turns out it's a pretty good tool for all of those goals, if managed properly, used in the right place. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that today. We have groups in California dedicated to this proposition. The California Rangeland Conservation Coalition now advertises all the great things that grazing and ranch management can produce for California. The California Rangeland Resolution that they generated says as much, that grazing is an important land management tool for biodiversity and other things, and it's been signed by really, oh, that's pretty ugly, but each one of them's in a box, so that's nice. But it's been signed by a bajillion agencies and entities agreeing that grazing can be a very valuable tool. We'll hear a lot more about that today for multiple ecosystem services. Now, where we are today, this is Tilden Park. It's kind of behind my house, circa 1900. The same view in 1990. We planted a lot of trees, we've let a lot of brush go, we've changed our landscapes, and by and large, we've changed them to be more flammable for one reason or another. The Berkeley Hills, this used to be a dairy up here. You can see a dairy trail in the middle, but you can also see some early plantation plantings in 1900 there, and pockets of eucalyptus and Monterey pine. And today we've got a lot of brush encroachment. I want to point out, we mentioned grazing as biomass control, but it also, in the right situations and with the right animals, can be very valuable for preventing brush encroachment and woody vegetation encroachment into grassland. So it has both a longer temporal scale impact and a short one of simply removing fine fuels. And we know what happened in Berkeley, Oakland Hills. This is one of the fires people talked about as one that went right into the urban areas and did damage some 4,000 homes. We've got some problems in Northern California, starting like with Marin, with conifer encroachment into our very valuable wildlife habitat, oak woodlands. You can see the conifers and the oaks kind of intermixed there. Eventually, this results in a woodland that's completely overtopped by Douglas fir. This is the kind of vegetation management problems that we're facing today. But on the other hand, the number of livestock in the state has declined over time. This big peak was sheep during World War I as a way to boost more food and so on. But in recent decades, numbers of sheep have gone down really a lot, and numbers of cattle have declined a bit as well. These are range cattle, not fed cattle. Sometimes. So I saw this in a talk one time by a guy who was an aquatic ecologist. And he said, here's this happy coral ecosystem with herbivorous and predatory fish eating algae and maintaining the corals. And I just saw an article, I was looking for a picture that they also pee on the coral, which is good for it for some reason. But anyway, it's a happy coral ecosystem, which when you remove the grazing fish or the herbivorous fish, you wind up with something like this. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, that's California. Today, we really, we'll see some more examples as time goes on, but we really got a lot of vegetation in this state, and it grows all winter and then dries all summer. And it's bound to catch fire now and again. Of course, Jennifer talked about the dead trees from drought stress because they're just too darn dense. And then, of course, we have this huge amount of Mediterranean annual grasslands that basically smothers habitats and smothers native plants that needs management. And this is where many of our grazing practices are aimed toward controlling this. Can grazing management help? It's no accident that you see this fire truck in a meadow, because grazed areas and open areas really are where people tell me they need to make a stand. And this is Hopland. The fire was able to be stopped at the grazed fence line above. It's low cost protection, biomass reduction around homes, that's been mentioned already. And we know that year to year, our grasslands, like fire behavior, are controlled largely by weather, particularly by rainfall and to some extent by temperatures. And this is illustrated, here's Tejon Ranch. 1 year, one same spot, then a couple of years later, if you look at year by year, the vegetation changes so much with rainfall. It's really dramatic. So we know that we're dealing in this novel ecosystem with a rainfall-driven system to a large extent. And so grazing for vegetation management, within year, it can really change, remove biomass, but it doesn't have an effect necessarily that lasts. But over years, you can prevent woody vegetation invasion. It depends on where you are and what kind of species you're talking about. Grazing and prescribed burning can work together, and there's many different grazing systems for all kinds of goals. Here's just an example. This area down here, this is grazed outside the fence line. But to conclude, I want to go back to Spain, my last couple slides. We have a lot of evidence. Begota means acorn in Spanish. It's a town in the valley, it's kind of a small town. European forests have been found, especially plantations, to be a carbon source at this point in Southern Europe, especially because they keep catching fire. And they're also eucalyptus, Monterey, Scotch pine, non-native species that were planted and they're burning down now. The most fire-resistant landscapes in Spain are agricultural, like these oak woodlands that are grazed. One of the differences between them and ours is that those troughs are 2,000 years old. So this has been practiced for a long time. It wasn't until World War II that all these forest plantations got put in. Now they have a program, a friend of mine has this program called Project Mosaic, designed to use agriculture to reduce fuel and break up fuel continuity. And of course, in large part, they're talking about grazing in Spain. And they talk about how the abandonment of our agriculture in the mountains increases the combustible fuel that accumulates without management. So the Spanish are still have some things to say about California. And I love this translation. Before, the mountains were clean because they were the appetite of all kinds of livestock. The fires are the result of the gradual disappearance of this important partner of the economy and rural culture. And so the question has to be asked. Thank you very much.
All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to begin introducing you to some people who actually are in the business and practice of managing animals for the purposes of fuels and other things as well. One thing that for those who may not have worked with these plant types so much to already understand this, but the livestock folks and the ecologists will talk a lot about this tension between grasses and herbaceous plants and shrubs and trees. And just so we'll make sure, I want to make sure everybody's on the same level here. But the kind of plant you grow is in large part a function of the amount of rainfall that you get. And so as the rainfall increases, you go from wildflowers and patches of grasses up to shrubs can become supported as rainfall increases a bit higher. And you get more rainfall still, you begin to support different species of trees begin to come into the mix. And a lot of California is kind of in the transition space between some of those rainfall zones. And in those areas, the ranchers historically, is to their benefit to try to keep the shrubs suppressed and keep the grasses. So the more rainfall you get, the more grass and wildflowers you grow up to a point, and then the shrubs begin to take over and they'll overtop them. And so this intercompetition as the plants are competing with each other. So ranchers have, for generations, learned to develop practices and skills for manipulating changes in the vegetation to keep them. And in the old days, it was all about you just want grass. So there are University of California extension publications for California explaining how to go into a chaparral belt or some other dense brushland in California and how to burn it all out, seed it to the right kind of grasses, fertilize it, wait for the rainfall to come, then turn it back into a grass pasture. And it'll stay that way if you graze it right for maybe a decade or two, at which time the shrubs come back in again. You've got to go through the process once more. This is a thing that the folks with the livestock have understood for quite a while. Now, as Lynn did a nice job of explaining, we're kind of now in a new world. Instead of looking at the landscape solely for producing meat and food products from the animals, we're trying to balance things and get meat and food products, but also balance it for environmental health, for wildlife habitat values and other things. So we become more sophisticated. So that's what the rest of the day is going to be about. What have we learned about the manipulation and use of livestock for controlling and managing vegetation so that we can think about what endpoint do we want and how do we want to manage it and what tools do we need, grazing included, to create a particular kind of vegetation composition in a place so that it satisfies our needs for environmental quality, habitat for important wildlife species, agricultural productivity, and so forth, and the protection of communities that struggle in these areas from fire. So this will be my closing point, and so I'll jump off of it fast, but think about this. All of our communities in California that are in what we call WUI areas, that is wildland-urban interface. So we have communities developing that are surrounded by wildland areas. Those communities are all going to have to start thinking hard, if they haven't already, about how do they want to manage that space that they live in that's outside the paved zone. What do they want it to look like? What kind of wildlife, what kind of plants do they want to have there? And then develop long-term plans for managing that land in the future to keep it in that place, okay? And so that's where we're going to go from here. So I'm going to leave the rest of it for my closing statements. And so now what I want to do is introduce you to a couple of people who represent some they're on the same spectrum, but slightly maybe different ends of this. And so with respect to livestock, so I'm going to want to have Billy Rohde step up for a few minutes. And Billy comes from a ranching family in California. And I wanted her to tell you a bit about what land management is like for the ranching community, whose main job in life is to provide for their families by raising livestock, by grazing these places. Okay, that's for food production. Then after that, I'm going to invite up Andre Soares, who has a business, and her business is in doing vegetation management for specific environmental and ecological purposes for cities and counties and utility districts and others that need to control weeds, manage fuels, keep the vegetation in a particular kind of balance. And so she's getting paid for bringing her livestock in to manage the fuel. Billy's family is raising livestock to sell the offspring for raising money for their family. Two different kind of spins. Both of them have to understand the plants and the vegetation. Both of them are trying to maintain a good ecological function in those places, but they're doing it for slightly different objectives. But they overlap a lot. So with that, Billy, you feel like you're ready to come up and give us an overview?
I have a quick question.
Yes,
Will all
please.
these presentations be available on the website?
Brandy?
We are going to try. We are experiencing some hurdles with ADA compliance as it relates to the recent bill that was passed, but we are going to try to have everything posted in addition to having videos posted of the presentations.
And mine would be impossible. It's a stream of consciousness that's going to attack me now. I first of all have to thank Lynn from the bottom of my heart, because after I listened to her, I don't feel like a second-class citizen anymore. And I want you to understand why I would feel that way at all. I'm very honored to be part of a ranching family that actually started before California was a state. My husband told me a great joke, and that was part of the family, before they collided, came here and in the gold rush and made a pile of money, and then spent all that money buying land, and they've been poor ever since. So I think the first thing that I want you to understand is I take you through my litany of crazy thoughts, is that ranching, at least how I know it, the families I've been around all of these years, 35 years now for me, is one part a way of life. It's a culture that's very different from people that have been raised in the cities or in different things. It's a great life if you like to work real hard, get up at 3 and 4 in the morning and go to bed after the sun goes down, and you feed the cattle before you feed yourself, and everything else comes before you. But the other thing is that grazing is, we're affected by so many things that there's oftentimes, I don't know which way to turn. So that's what I wanted to let you know, and people that you know that have, are in contact with various agencies and people that talk about how we might manage cattle grazing or might not manage cattle grazing. I just want to put my face on this for you to understand. The first thing we do as ranchers is try desperately to take good care of the land. Because if we don't manage those resources well, then we don't raise calves, our cattle won't reproduce, nothing goes right if we don't do that. So the thought of the old saying that everybody thought you could just overgraze until, whatever, it doesn't work that way, because if you do that, you'll be punished. And eventually you'll be out of business. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about. In that realm also, no two ranchers are alike. No two families are alike. Ranching is so varied, so diverse. Some of us practice transhumance. Another professor that I loved with all my heart called it following the grain. And that's what we did. We start in the valley in the winter, in the spring, and then we go up to the mountains in late spring, early summer, and I'll get on to why we come home early now at the end of my talk. But a lot of how we raise our cattle, how we run our ranch has changed tremendously in the past 3 years, and not for the good. And so one of the things that I want to let you know, and I'm not whining about this, is that whether or not we stay in business and we continue to graze has a lot to do with decisions that people make that they may not understand the ramifications, the overall ramifications that they're going to have on vast tracts of land. So back in the 80s, it was timber management, spotted owl. For me, in my simplistic way and not knowing anything, I saw that as a form of monoculture. We were going to select for certain kind of trees in the forest, and we weren't going to touch them. There was a little bit of talk about preservation. That's the way I saw it. I'm not saying that's right, wrong, or indifferent. I just need you to understand what it looked like from my side of the world. So while we were up there running our cattle in the mountains, trying to protect our mountain meadows, one of the things that we started seeing in the stringer meadows in the Forest Service land was the encroachment of a lot of trees that didn't belong there, and the loss of a lot of meadows that not only took care of our cattle being out there, but in particular the deer and the antelope, and we have a wonderful herd of antelope up there still. But it started changing the way the wildlife, the numbers, where they could go for feed, and the pressure put on them. Over the years, it just keeps changing. Another year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we're talking about removing cattle grazing from a lot of places up there on Forest Service land on account of a bird, a willow flycatcher. And they felt that the cattle were probably not good for willow flycatcher habitat, and they were looking at 5-mile circumference areas where they would remove cattle from grazing there. Thankfully, that didn't go any further because the science wasn't upheld. It didn't finally go into the point of managing us off. Do we care about willow flycatchers? Yes. Do we care about timber management? Yes. On our ranch, we even have timber properties. So we were able to try to thin our forest down a little bit and keep that in good shape while we looked across right next to us at the time where the Forest Service could not because of the laws that were going on. And we saw a vast difference. We saw the beetles start coming in. We saw some of the ribbons of red, we call it, when the trees are starting to die. But on our private property, we saw still some pretty healthy forest. Small, but at least healthy. So after that, we've had one of the most interesting things that I saw happen is that a lot of people decided that cattle should not be on some of these plains ground areas where they had vernal pools and vernal pool species. And there was a lot going on to call for the critical habitat and possible removal of cattle. I listened to many well-meaning scientists talk about how deleterious grazing was to vernal pools. And what I want to tell you again from my standpoint is on our ranch in the valley, we have about 3,000 acres of area that we graze. And right across the highway, we have this small parcel of land. It's probably about 40, 50 acres or so. It hasn't been grazed for at least 40 years. And that particular piece of ground right across the highway is rife with vernal pools, but you'd never know it. You'd never know it at all. I haven't seen any of the beautiful flowers and all the things that go on because the overgrowth is so high, whatever is growing there now, the grasses, they obliterate what was going on with the vernal pools. On the other hand, on the ranch where we graze, when the water hits us right and the conditions are good, it's just beautiful to see the rings of flowers around the vernal pools and the fact that they're there because it goes hand in hand. Grazing is an enhancement to vernal pools. Without that grazing, you wouldn't know they're there. So we made it past that. We also, in the 80s, we decided because of the lack of burning, which the ranchers did very much feel was important for many years. In 1984, some of the ranchers got together and worked with CAL FIRE to have a very large prescribed fire. And at that time, the idea was, I think more, like what you were talking about, taking down the brush and making more grass. Some people were thinking that. Some people were thinking about improving the habitat for the deer as well as the cattle. That foothill area is just full of deer. But that came with major problems, and that was air quality became an issue to folks, and then all of a sudden we heard that they don't want to burn anymore because of the air quality. So it didn't happen anymore. The other thing is, and this is only on our ranch, and it may have to do with what grows where, but one of the things that my family saw is once you burn like that, in order to really maintain that level of what they had gotten, it would be you'd have to burn about every 5 years, which is just too often. Because then you're not going to, depending on what you're going to do, if you're going to keep the cattle off for a year, you're going to lose a lot of traction and maybe not gain what you thought you were going to do. So that's another issue. Where you burn, what kind of vegetation you're burning makes a lot of difference. So I'm glad to hear, and I really sincerely mean this, now that CAL FIRE is working on the control burns again, that maybe different agencies can come together, especially with air quality, to understand, like we know, that these control burns are far less noxious than what we've experienced from the catastrophic wildfire. When the Paradise Fire hit, even though we were probably 25 miles or more from that fire, our cattle looked ill. You couldn't breathe out there very well, but our cattle showed signs of just how bad that air was. So just a thought, I would have never thought about it except for looking at all of them and seeing what that did. So then we get to the next part, and this is where I want to end, and that is the unintended consequences. I am looking at all of our cattle coming down from the mountains this week, and they're coming down more than a month early because we cannot keep these new wolves from killing our cattle. And we've tried, Defenders of Wildlife have been kind enough to put money into getting flattery on our ranch to help us to protect our cattle. But what I want you to understand, and I hope what your takeaway is, that when you look at one thing myopically, such as the wolf, and you don't understand, or it's just not as important, all these other things that are happening, whether the ranchers in this area that are being affected by them are whether they're gonna be able to stay there or not is very much up in the air. And our losses are not the animals that are killed, although it breaks my heart and I don't go near it anymore because it's too upsetting. But our losses are phenomenal in the tens of thousands of pounds of beef that we're not able to produce because we're going backwards every year, we're not gaining. And that was the whole idea of going up there. And the other thing is the amount of money that we spend to feed cattle because we can't turn out on those forests. And so that's what I want to let you know is that over half of our timber leases, Forest Service allotments have not been used in the past 3 years because we can't turn our cattle out there. It used to be they'd go out and we would have them in a rotational grazing pattern. We can't do that now because we can't protect them from wolves. So that's something where I'm hoping we can have a discussion. But in your travels and talking with different people, I don't have anything against anything except for myopic vision, how it's affecting us, and I want very much for you to understand that.
Let me add, I guess I'll add a dimension to that. So I think that one of the things that maybe Billy didn't say directly, though, in this particular case, when there are ranch families up in the Sierras that are currently concerned about the wolf issue, some of them, like the Roneys, are abandoning their allotments because of concerns about wolves, and there have been some kills and stuff in that area. How are we tying back into fire? So one of the things that the Forest Service and the ranchers and other folks up in the Sierras are concerned about is if some number of those allotments become abandoned from grazing for some period of time as a result of the wolves, one of the unintended consequences of that going on is all of a sudden now we've got accumulations of those fine fuels building up in those forested areas. Question is, all right, so what are we going to do about that? Because if we can't have the animals up there to harvest the grass, to keep the fuel levels low enough to protect the trees, and the trees are at high levels of density, which means once the fire gets started. So this is one of these complicated problems. So, you know, the wolves themselves are not the issue, but the issue is how are we as a society going to think about, so how do we manage this? What's the appropriate way to manage this to keep all these resources functioning? Okay, with that, Andre, would you like to come up? And so Andre and Billy are both members of the RMAC committee. And so, Andre, could you tell us a bit about what it's like in your world?
Yes. Thank you. I'm Andre Soares. I, as Mark mentioned, sit on RMAC as a representative for the California Wolverine Association. And my main focus of my business is vegetation management for fire fuel reduction. I'm a third generation sheep rancher in the state of California, and the generation before that were herding sheep in Spain. So it's in my blood. I did take a little hiatus for 29 years. I was a neonatal nurse, had a whole other life and family, and had my kids, and then decided I wanted to do this. And so my father still runs a commercial sheep operation, and the opportunity came for me to do something a little bit different, and so I have a targeted grazing operation. And I don't know how to run this. There we go. Yeah, need that, so I'm gonna go over here. So my job here today is to try to convey so I'm on the ground, I'm a practitioner, I'm doing this on the ground, and my goal here is to help people who have responsibilities and are considering using grazing as a tool, to kind of, where do you start? Why should you do it? What's it going to look like? What's my role going to be in it? And how do I engage with a potential grazer? So why should you do it? It can meet vegetation management goals and improve soils at the same time. Environmentally friendly, reduces the use of herbicides and fossil fuels. Livestock can often access terrain not easily, safely accessible to people or machinery. It's quiet, almost passive method, often more cost effective, publicly pleasing, and hashtag it just makes sense. You know, this is one tool in the toolbox. It goes hand in hand with a lot of the other tools that have come up or you've seen or have been historically used. And in fact, it's so original, it's so unique. This is what's happened in the landscapes in California for generations and generations. And it wasn't until we came to a point where we were feeling the impact of loss of livestock on the land that I think most people in the industry realized they had to articulate what they had just grown up knowing, because they were raised in ranching families. And I know that when I began, which was only 5 years ago or so, I realized in visiting with my father, you know, the fact that I was having to articulate, and he was looking back at me like, this is so basic, I can't believe you're actually letting me know this, you know this. I asked him questions and it was like, he didn't even know people needed to know that, you know. This is the carbon cycle. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a formal presenter, you can tell by the non-scientific carbon cycle images that I selected here, but Grazing takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it back into the soil. Simple as that. Carbon sequestration while producing food and fiber. Just makes sense. Livestock, so I do sheep and goats. Cattle are used for grazing as well as what most people think about. I think when you think about grazing in general, the tools that I use and livestock that I'm familiar with and know how to manipulate are sheep and goats. So that's the basis of what I'm talking about. That's from where I come from. You should know that. Where do you start? Can grazing really help you meet your objectives? What will it look like, and what will I need to do to provide? What will I need to do to provide? What will I need to provide in order to make this work? And I say that I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody who might be responsible for managing land and is considering vegetation management with grazing. Where do you start? You need to have your organizational buy-in. I know that sometimes is not easy. Speak with colleagues who you know are using it or have used it. Use your resources. California Wool Growers Association website. There's, you'll hear about later this afternoon, targeted grazer database. Just Google, just learn about what people are doing out there. And then there's the whole element of service provider selection. How can it meet your objectives? It can be used for fire fuel principle on strategic areas. It's a treatment method often, I'm seeing now much more often specified for EIR requirements. Some agencies are required to use grazing to remove vegetation. And one of the reasons is because it actually removes the vegetation, takes it off the land. Okay, it's not cutting and leaving it, it's removing the vegetation. Prescribed fire does the same thing, but prescribed fire, as you know, puts carbon back up into the atmosphere, and grazing does the absolute opposite. Reduction or eradication of noxious or overgrown vegetation, defensible space, and maintenance of open spaces. What will it look like? I'm going to go through all of these things just to kind of give you an idea of what you might be getting into. Transportation. Depending on where we're going, we're going to be transporting in either gooseneck trailers or semis. Often we're doing work in difficult to get to areas in the Bay Area. Most of our work is in the WUI. And so we have tried to move the most efficient form of transportation, but sometimes we have to do goosenecks because we can't get semis in where we're going. So we pull in when we can. You can see on the left, those are a couple of semis. Those were when the animals were coming home this fall. This picture on the right is actually up in Orinda, where we're unloading. We'll come with herders and dogs. Dogs are absolutely critical tools for us on the ground, and so is our labor force. Our herders, most herders I think I can say, majority of grazing operations use sheep herders on site. A lot of the agencies that employ targeted grazing will require that for security and safety reasons and all that kind of stuff. That makes good sense. Our herders come to us from our here on H-2A work visas. The majority of the herders in all the western states come from Peru. You can see, a picture paints 1,000 words, so you're going to see a lot of that in this presentation. That's a fence line, obviously, 2 fence lines from the path that we've grazed in the past 2 years. Here we are unloading again. The picture on the right is we'll pull, when it's time to load out of an area, we come in with portable corral units, set them up, push the animals into the corral and then into the trucks, and up and out we go. Here we are. This is what the portable electric fence looks like. It's solar powered, low voltage. That's what it looks like, and it's fairly easy to put up and take down, assuming they're in the area that you can get a fence line in there to begin with. Sometimes we may have to use a weed whacker to go in and cut a fence line. And sometimes we've got long-term partnerships with people who get to understand what they need to do to help us do our job. And sometimes they will cut and maintain a very small fence line space so that we can quickly get in, put it up, take it down. We do a lot of our work in very close to public areas, recreational areas, neighborhoods, open spaces, regional parks. It's very important that signage is very important. Communication is key before, during, and after any of the grazing projects. So we do use a lot of that, and I think the agencies that use grazers as well as from our perspective, find it really, really helpful. This is 410 goats before and after, clearing out understory. You can see here, this is up in Marin, and the area of what our goal there was to reduce the vegetation along the fire roads so that when that fire does come, because they recognize in that area, they're living with wildfire. So their goal was not to clear all the landscape. Their goal is to create spaces so that when they know those surface streets are not going to be passable for emergency units, they can use the fire roads and they're not going to cause fires by getting on the fire roads. So we're helping them keep defensible space and open up the sides of the fire roads in Marin and other strategic areas. And hopefully you'll get to hear from some of those people a little bit later because they've done some really cool stuff. It's publicly pleasing. People like it. This is an area in Half Moon Bay. We moved the animals there one day. We walked them from one location to another up the street, and I'm not kidding you, this happens year after year, and 75 people come out on that day. They bring their kids, they bring their cameras, they bring their parents. It's people just like it. So that makes it easier for the agencies. Is a goat a goat or a sheep a sheep? You'll see the picture on the left. The picture on this vegetation here that you see is more green, was grazed, and so was the vegetation on the right. You see the fence line. On the left was done with smaller framed animals. They were all does, female goats, and they just naturally have a smaller stature, smaller body weight. Animals eat, how much they consume is a function of their body weight most of the time. So the vegetation on the right was grazed with a herd of castrated male goats that are called wethers. They're naturally bigger. They will eat more on a daily basis. They can get up higher. So that's the same vegetation, one grazed with a smaller animal, one on the right grazed with a larger animal. And two different agencies, as a matter of fact, and two different grazing companies. So it is, it does matter. And you see on the right, goats tend to, they'll, I'm not going to get into that too much, but we prescribe the type of animals we're going to put on a site based on the vegetation type and a number of other things. Goats are going to get up higher. They'll get up on their hind legs. They can eat up to 6 feet high if you have the right size goat, and really clean up the ladder field. So depending on what the vegetation is, a prescription of animal herd size and species will be applied. So what are the project planning variables for the operator? These are the variables on the left: location, transportation requirements, seasonal timing, type and density of vegetation, terrain, environmental considerations, access to water, mapping, and risk. Those are variables that we use to determine the prescription of the herd size, the prescription of the species, sheep, goats, or mixed, or cattle. We don't do cattle, but for cattle are applicable. Scheduling and timing and cost. It's important for someone who's considering to employ grazing to understand that I want the scheduling and timing element there. Grazing is, we're dealing with live animals. They have to be fed 24/7. It's a 24/7 operation, and so we can't just say we're going to end work, we're going to stop working for you today, and then we're not going to start at your neighbors till day after tomorrow, because those animals have to eat every single hour, right, unless they're bedded down. So the flexibility, it's important for someone who's going to consider using grazing to understand that need for flexibility when it comes to scheduling. Here I talked about semi versus gooseneck, did that already. When we move into an operation, it takes a lot of resources. We're moving in a camp for the herder, which is self-contained camper. We're moving in water tanks often. We're moving in the livestock. Seasonal timing, spring and summer versus fall and winter. Those are all variables that help determine herd size and cost. The density of the vegetation, I'll get to that in a second. There are also local municipal or fire agency ordinances that may say you need to have your vegetation cleared by this date. So that also plays into the timing. Biological determinants. Are there reasons that you need to get there earlier because your agency has determined that grazing can't take place after May 15th? All of those things we understand we can work with most of the time. And then regional climates, the vegetation changes from year to year, as we've heard all morning, based on climate and precipitation. So that all plays into the timing. And again, I want to stress the need to have some flexibility in all of that. Type and density of vegetation will give us information about the nutrient value for the livestock. Is the nutrient value for the livestock such that while they're there, we're going to have to provide them with supplemental feed? Most of the time we don't. I mean, my experience is 95% of the time we don't do that. We haven't needed to do that, but for the sustainability of our operation, it's important that we keep our animals healthy, and we don't like to sacrifice anything. We don't like to sacrifice our herd health for this type of work, but it is something we consider. And then how long will the treatment take to complete? If I walk into a space in September, it's going to take me a lot less time than it's going to take me to get through in March most of the time, right? Because there's more dense vegetation and more moisture, it's going to take more time. The terrain, what's the slope like? How hard is it going to be to get fencing up? What's the risk going to be to keep the animals contained? Environmental sensitivities. We often will meet with biologists on site who will show us the maps that they're working with, where we need to stay out of, create exclusion areas. We often do training with our herders on site, with the biologists, to look out for certain species and report if we identify any of those while on site. Mapping and surveillance is important, and then, like I mentioned, operator training if necessary. Water access. This is really important when we're considering going onto a site. Is there water right on site? If so, how easy is it to get that water from the source to where the livestock are going to be? Remember, the livestock in most of these targeted grazing operations are not in one large paddock. They're in smaller paddocks, targeted along, 50 feet, maybe 50 feet wide at a time, much larger at another time. But how feasible is it to get the water source to the animals? Often, if there isn't on site, we often will get a hydrant meter from the local water district. Use the hydrant meter to fill our portable water tanks, and then do our best to get the water tanks again to the animals. Mapping is very important when working with practitioners on the ground. We love good, clear information because we want to do the best job for you. So the way you can help is providing good maps that give us good acreage, identify exclusion areas. There's many variations of maps that we've used. We do our own sometimes if the client is not, if you provide their own. Google Earth style images work well, and mostly because they include landmarks. And when the herders are on the ground building fences, they can easily translate Google Maps to on the ground practice because of the landmark. So it's easy for them to use that to know where to put their fences up and where not to have their fences. Here's one sample of a map. This is one we did based on a much more complicated agency version, and we use it within our own team, and we share it back and forth with the agency to communicate, let them know where the herd is at any given time. You notice that we've identified a camp location. On some, we'll go so far as identify water sources if we need to. The maps we use and ultimately prepare for use on the ground are based a lot on, is this a new project? Is it new for the community? Is it new for us? Is it new for the client or the project manager on the agency side? It's very, very helpful if everybody is working off the same map. So when you're communicating, you can be talking apples and apples. This is another version. This is just something we did really quick. This is Google Earth. This is Google Earth work, the work that I just did for an HOA, but a variety of them work, but ones with landmarks are good. Risk and liability. This is a big portion of what I think sets targeted grazing apart from traditional grazing, and that is we often are operating in areas very close to the public. Lots of human interaction, walkers with dogs, highways, lots of time on the road. There's a lot of transportation in this type of work. And so that liability is real. In the Bay Area, you know what that traffic is like. Hauling a goosenecks and manipulating goosenecks in the Bay Area is something I don't do it. Well, they made me do it once. Notice they said once. But the risk is real, and it's not easy to do. And security of the livestock. If these livestock get out, it's one thing if they eat a neighbor's yard, which is awful, but we accept responsibility for that. It's another thing if they get out on a highway, and that happens too. They're animals. Wind can blow down a fence. It's happened. So liability is a real big factor. Here we are crossing, that's 800 animals. That's at the Highway 1324 junction in Orinda, Lafayette area. And we've got CHP there helping us why there's not cars everywhere. But we do engage CHP to help us when we need to do that. And they're very easy to work with. A lot of people, I think, are reluctant. They feel like it's working with livestock and the public is risky and going to be negative. I'm going to be honest and stand here and tell you 95% of all of the interaction that we've experienced for 5 years working with the public has been positive. What are the cost drivers? Labor. Because of the size of the operations, we're normally working in herds of about 400 as opposed to commercial livestock operation. I've got 5,000 head. Normally I could do that with 3 herders. It takes me more like 9 herders to operate my 5,000 head now during the grazing season because we break it up into smaller herds. It just takes more manpower. Liability and workers' compensation, transportation, support services for remote or distant operations. So at some points in the season, I could be operating in 5 different counties. My whole team is really spread out. It takes a lot more support services to sustain that safely. Project management, depending on the size of the project and what your goals are, it could take one person managing one project, and that person usually is not me because I'm kind of one step taking a bigger, broad look at what's going on. But so that takes more manpower. It's a 24/7 operation. One of the things when I got into this, my father told me, I decided to do it. Then I told my dad, because I knew he'd try to talk me out of it. And he told me, oh, God, you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be doing it. You want the phone calls in the middle of the night. You don't want to be up in the middle of the night worried about the animals. And I said, I'm a neonatal nurse. On a bad day at work, babies die. How bad can this be? And it was an easy transition for me. I 24/7 hospital work at I was management. 24/7, this is similar. You have to, it is. You have to, your phone, you never turn your phone off, Ability to feed animals year round. So I do targeted grazing for as a service for feed, but that's not a year round model, right? So targeted grazing, if I'm successful and getting all my animals out to work, I'm doing that between February and end of September about, but those other months, it's the reverse model for me. So I have to be able to feed my animals in that off season. Regulatory impacts. There's one big one that we're faced with right now, and that is ag overtime. As a result of legislation beginning for large employers, it began January 2019. For small employers, which is most of all the sheep industry in California, sheep herders who are actually H2A sheep herders who are regulated by the federal government, the state of California decided that we have to now pay overtime on a 24-hour clock, which is really a problem. What that does is you can see for sheep herders, as you look down at this blue line, this is what the ag overtime bill did to the rest of ag. The red line is what the ag overtime bill is doing to sheep and goat ranchers in the state of California. That's a 51% increase in 1 year. That is not sustainable for commercial livestock operations, sheep and goat operation in the state of California. We're working hard to make some headway there and hopefully get some changes before 2022, which is when small employers have to comply. But if that doesn't change, the number of livestock on the land that we already heard all morning is reducing, will reduce dramatically, absolutely dramatically. So AB 1066, as it has been interpreted now for sheep herders, is a nail in the coffin that we are really trying to change in the next couple of years. Details and considerations. If you're responsible for a request for proposal, seek other agency examples. Sometimes I know people get frozen at this point, but seek other agencies for example. Site assessments are important. You need to know your site and you need to make time to take the operator or the potential operator out to the site so they can properly assess and give you a good bid. Contracting, variety are used, keep it simple. I've had to deal with no contract, which is, then I come up with my own, which is not terrible. But then I also had to find my way, I've been able to fit into literally 95-page contracts. So I just would urge you, keep it simple as much as you can within your agency minimum requirements. Insurance is a key factor that operators have to have. Then the basics, have keys if they need to be able to access your area, make sure you've got keys for them. Consider the fact they may need to have water meters and what the water situation is going to be. What might you not have considered? Grazing is not a terminal treatment plant. It requires maintenance of some sort. Of course, I put in maintenance grazing, but it requires maintenance. It's not a terminal treatment plant. Consider the animal health. Don't have unrealistic expectations about what the animals are going to come in and do. If you put into a contract that you want the vegetation down to bare ground, which I've seen in a contract, you're probably not going to really get it. And secondly, it's unrealistic. It's not sustainable to expect livestock to graze down to bare ground. It's not sustainable. The operator's not going to want it for their animals, and it's not good for the ground. So be realistic about your expectations. Agreement should reflect things that are realistic, length, range of residual vegetation, brush versus grasses. Consider the vegetation stages with seasonal changes, meaning, and we learned this over time, at some point in July, the animals stop eating broom in Marin County. But they love it up until then, and that changes every year when that's getting, so we're learning about that. And the duration of the grazing treatment. Consider that. And also planning. I don't know if I put this anywhere, but if you have a project that you've decided, maybe you tried it 1 year, and a year or two, you're like, yeah, I really want to do this moving into the future. Multi-year contracts are really helpful to both you and the operator, because if I'm your operator, you want me to come back year after year, I need to kind of know that, because I will sustain my herd for that work. I can't go out and buy 1,000 goats tomorrow because I can buy them in Texas. It doesn't work that way. They have to be fence trained. They have to be, a goat is not a goat is not a goat. And it won't be successful if I go and buy 1,000 goats out of Texas and deliver them to the East Bay tomorrow. That'll be a disaster. So planning is very, very important. What works well? This is a picture. I really like this picture because this is my herder on the your far left. That's my project manager next to him. A fire agency person who you're going to hopefully hear from later this afternoon, and an open space person. So that is the land manager, the fire person, project manager for grazing, and the herder who's on the ground. That's on a walkthrough. We're all working from the same, I was present there, we're all working from the same maps. We're working together and learning where should we stay out of, what do we need to avoid, what's the best place to get the animals into this area, where are we going to exit the area, where's the best place to put the camp, where can we get water, where can we not get water, and then how are we going to mitigate, what are we going to do to troubleshoot getting water. We literally knock on doors asking neighbors if that's the last resort, and 9 times out of 10 they're happy to help. But you have to be creative in making this work, and employ your community, engage them, and it's really it works so much better when you have advanced communication during the project, a mode of communication, and then post-grazing is always important for the following year. And this is a video I'm not going to show because it's a little corny, but does anybody have any questions for me?
I can imagine you have a lot of questions. Let me say this, that Andre's going to be up, we're going to have a panel discussion after lunch. And so what I'd suggest is I want to kind of move us towards lunch. So if you have questions, hang on to them. We're going to have Andre back up and we will ask her more questions in more detail about what she showed. So I told Sheila that I was going to give a quick explanation of what we meant by prescribed grazing. So Andre already did that for me. So I think, so the fire guys, you understand what's meant by prescribed burn, right? That you got to have a detailed plan showing when you can burn, when you can't burn, how it's going to be conducted, and all those details. And probably many of you came to this meeting going, oh, we're learning about grazing. So this could be, you know, backing up a trailer to a lot and turning the animals out for a day or two and put it back in the truck and away you go. I hope that you understand now, thanks to Andre's presentation, that what goes into developing a detailed prescription for a grazing practice for fuels or weed control or habitat management, whatever else you're going to try to do, is actually a fairly detailed project, right? And Andre only hit the highlights. There's many more layers of detail that a well-trained and qualified person who understands how to get the job done well is going to have to do. So in many communities, there are lots of livestock available. There may be some ungrazed areas in a strategic area around the community that would benefit from some grazing. And so it's easy to open up the gate, put some animals in there for a while and get the job done. There are other places where there's a need for vegetation management around a WUI zone or a school or something else, but you got, I'll do this fast. When I taught at Chico State, those of you who know Chico, there's Bidwell Park. Chico considers itself the city of trees. They love their oaks. Back about a decade or decade and a half ago, Chico hired a goat contract from Colorado to come in and graze yellow star thistle in Bidwell Park. So I was teaching a class on range there and thought, oh, this is going to be fun. Because why? They brought in a person from out of state who was not familiar with the area. Just as Andre was explaining, brought in a bunch of goats who were familiar with vegetation in Colorado to California, who were really unfamiliar with the vegetation here. I know goats fairly well, not as well as Andre, but well enough. And also it was the end of the season. So the yellow star thistle was already dried, dead, gone. It was the wrong time to be doing it. The baby oak trees, though, were juicy and green. And so it became quite the mess, and then the public, arguments in the paper about what fool brought these goats. These goats are awful creatures. No, the goats aren't awful creatures, but they were used improperly. And so that's why you need a professional person on those kinds of projects who understands what's going on and the consequences. Now, I have an issue to deal with. So I need to get Sheila in, but I also need to get us to lunch before the lunchtime mob breaks out in Sacramento. We're going to be waiting for an hour to get me food. Sheila, are you going to be here through lunch?
Sure.
Okay. If you guys don't mind, if Sheila doesn't mind, what I think I want to do is I want to roll off to lunch now, try to get slightly ahead of the lunch crowd, get food, come back, and we'll have Sheila go first when we get back from lunch. Now the plan, Brandy, help me out. The plan was we do have space reserved on the south side of the Capitol over on the lawn. So we've got maps that Brandy printed out up front. Maybe we're going to have a map coming up on the screen showing where the food is nearby the Capitol area. And so for those of you like me who don't know the Capitol area very well, we've got a map, and those of you who are familiar with Sacramento, feel free to lead small foraging groups over to food and help people to find their way back to the Capitol where we can meet up over there. If you get lost, find your way back here as best you can. we were just gonna have lunch there. Grab lunch, if you can, grab lunch, come over, meet us on the south side of the Capitol, we'll continue conversation. Let us aim to be back here by 12:45. So folks, try to be back here by 12:45. You're welcome to bring your lunch to the south side of the Capitol on the lawn and meet up with us there.
Extension Director and Range Management Specialist, among many other things nowadays. And so I asked Sheila if she could, so we mentioned about the use of livestock for prescribed targeted grazing, particularly for managing fuel. There has been in the history of California using livestock, there have been some mistakes and misapplications of livestock which have led to some damage of various kinds. So I asked Sheila if she could at least make a few statements from her perspective as an applied scientist about uses of grazing, and I'll let her take it where she wants to go about the good and the bad of those grazing impacts. And then we're going to roll into a panel discussion following Glenn Nader's presentation on specifically the hows and tos and whys and wherefores of using livestock for the management and maintenance of fine fields. So Sheila, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I have some slides. I don't see them up yet, right? Are they coming? Well, coming from the San Francisco Bay Area, I felt like, which is the origin right now of at least 7 startups who are trying to produce faux meat. I felt a little bit obligated to sort of dispel one of the assumptions or myths that they're promulgating, and that comes from the CEO, Patrick Brown of Impossible Foods, who says that animal agriculture is an outdated technology and one that he is determined to get rid of. I think that clearly ignores the role of livestock grazing on rangelands, and particularly in California rangelands. And as well as, you know, we talked a little bit about prescriptive grazing, but I just want you to remember that we still have on our landscape about 2 million head of livestock that are grazing, and each year they are consuming about 9 million tons of forage. And if you think about that, that is growing naturally every year. Whether or not we have cows or we eat meat, that's still going to grow. Okay. See the little version of my slide. So
We're working on it. Roll through it.
We'll move forward. So the main points that I want to cover in talking to you about livestock impacts and how we manage them are that California's rangelands are altered and changing. Livestock grazing, which is the primary land use in California, impacts vegetation and ecosystems, and these impacts are not inherently negative. In fact, they have many benefits. And finally, livestock impacts can be managed to achieve resource management objectives and minimize negative impacts. So California rangelands are altered and changing, and we heard quite a bit about this from Lynn Hunsinger. And first I wanted though to point out, and I have a bit of a different statistic than Mark showed. I think he showed 63%. So somewhere like we could split the difference and say 60% of California is rangelands, and they're often, as Mark defined, what they are not. They're not cultivated, they're not forested, they're not desert, and they provide some herbaceous vegetation. But it's not just the breadth of our rangelands that's so important. They are also one of the world's, host one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, meaning there are more species native and then endemic to California and its rangelands than most other places in the world. And so managing for these endemics becomes really important, and is even regulated under our regulations like the Endangered Species Act. So what does California's biodiversity look like? It's not always this visible, as this picture is in the Coyote Valley just south of San Jose. But what is typical is a lot of our native flora are really short. And a lot of the animals that that live in our rangelands that are endemic also are not used to dense vegetation. So hence, we're getting to this idea that there might be a role for grazing. And the idea, as Lynn said, we don't really know what California was, although we do know also from the journals of the Spaniards who called the land Tierra del Fuego, which I thought was interesting out of fire talk, but not meaning about fire, but in this case, meaning about the vast grasslands or forb lands, I guess you could say, that they saw. We also know, however, that California is largely invaded, and sometimes intentionally, like this is a wild mustard that was deliberately brought, and confuses people now. So you might have heard about the super bloom, and maybe even some of you saw the super bloom this past year. Well, this was the noted as being the bully super bloom, because many people were out taking pictures of mustard, believing that they had seen the super bloom. And of course, this is a non-native plant that now is pretty dominant, and particularly in places where we don't have livestock grazing. So even if we're not really certain of what our landscape was like, and we don't know exactly what the ensemble of herbivores was, it is quite clear that we are managing a much different ecosystem, and one that is largely invaded by non-native annuals, and also in many cases encroached on by brush. And this continues to change, as Lynn noted, but specifically because of things like nitrogen deposition. So we have nitrogen deposition, the non-blue parts on that map are the higher levels of nitrogen deposition. So both the topography of the state, but also the fact that we have activities including automobile exhaust, because that's where some of the nitrogen comes from. And nitrogen is a fertilizer, and it grows more grass. And so that's what we see, even though the levels are really low, like upwards towards 45 pounds per acre, some of our highest levels. So in agronomic terms, that's really low. But when you talk about our rangelands that aren't used to that sort of level of nutrient, that grows more grass. It's also not clear what climate change will do, but we do have some modeling in the Bay Area that shows we might grow 30 to 40% more forage, more grass. That's because of the temperature change. So once again, we may be looking at a scenario where we're going to have more vegetation that we need to manage to achieve goals like fire fuels management, and even protecting or conserving our state's a large number of listed species. So we have something like 300, I think there's been quite a few delistings recently, so maybe we're down to like 200, I think, and 87 species now in California that are listed, and many of them have, I've calculated about 70% of them have some sort of nexus with grazing, so some sort of relationship to grazed land.
And by that, Sheila, you mean that they have a preference for grazed land or grazing?
They occur there, and I'll get into how some of them are benefiting from grazing. So yes, so California's rangelands are altered and changing, and livestock grazing, which is a primary land use, impacts vegetation and ecosystems, and these impacts are not always negative. These impacts include impacts of the livestock and of the managers. And oftentimes when people think about grazing, is all they think about is the fact that that animal went and ate a plant. Well, there's other things that are happening, and some of that is demonstrated in this data that I've been working on. So this is looking at the impacts of grazing on all the federally listed species in California, and what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is saying about grazing. And the top up there, I don't know if this pointer works. I don't know. Anyways, the top bar, which is green, are grazing benefits to species, and the bottom bar, which is red, shows that species that are impacted by grazing. And I'm going to share a little bit about what some of these impacts are, but I will tell you that the ones where they're showing negative impacts to grazing are often indirect impacts, like fish, for example, and impacts that might come from multiple sources, including grazing, where we have excessive extra sediment in streams or other pollutants. As well as some direct impacts where an animal might step on an individual species or eat an individual species, and we just don't really know how grazing impacts the whole habitat otherwise. And so, but the bottom is different habitats in which this is occurring. So the biggest green is in our grasslands, where you see the biggest benefit of number of species benefiting from grazing, and there's vernal pools up there, wetlands, and literally every type of habitat in California has some species that benefits from livestock grazing, with the exception of the one on the far left, which is alpine. So that's the only eco type in this data that didn't show that. So what are these impacts? What do the livestock do? Well, in addition to eating a plant, they trample. And they also can redistribute nutrients. And what do the ranchers do? Well, they're creating infrastructure, and that includes roads and ponds and water sources. They manage vegetation, and they might do that in addition to grazing in order to help their grazing. That might be, and I should have added a prescribed fire on here too, but mechanical, chemical, biological. And they also manage livestock. So even those that aren't doing prescriptive grazing are still largely managing their livestock to manage the forage and manage the livestock for livestock production. So what are these impacts then of both the rancher and the livestock? It can impact species composition, ecosystem function, and ecosystem structure. And so species composition, we have some really illustrative examples coming from places like our serpentine grasslands. And this was highlighted by work done by Stuart Weiss, who looked at the fact that on our serpentine soils, as I mentioned, they were getting lots of nitrogen input. So on the left side of the slide, where you see Italian ryegrass growing, that's ungrazed, and on the right side, where you see the goldfields, that's a native flora and also habitat for the bay checker spot butterfly. So here's a really clear evidence that, you know, livestock grazing can impact species composition, and particularly in this case of changing an annual grass to, or enhancing habitat for an annual forb over an annual grass. And livestock are super effective with it. Not so much people who tried to go out, and in this case, this is the Arana Gulch down in Santa Cruz, where there's habitat for the Santa Cruz tar plant, 17 acres, and they thought they'd take on annual management of grass. So they worked hard, and they, as I think Andrea mentioned also, you know, it's also livestock remove it. So they had to collect it and remove it in order to get the desired effect to create the conditions right for this forb, the Santa Cruz tar plant. And I think they got about a ½ acre done and decided that it's a lot of work and not something that could be done, not just even just once, but imagine now we have landscapes that we need this annual, it's an annual treatment. And that's, I think, really important to think about when we think about, you know, the role of prescribed fire versus grazing, is that, you know, we're not generally doing annual fire treatments, not, you know, so fire has a different role. It has a role, but it's different. Also, we see that grazing in terms of species composition can maintain a grassland. And so this is an example up from San Bruno Mountain, which, you know, it takes a lot longer to see this sort of change, but after time, brush is encroached into this grassland, and this is an important grassland. It's where the first habitat conservation plan was implemented, and it's habitat for butterfly, and there should be a good ford population there that there's not. It also should be a grassland in order to maintain a habitat for these species. So there's efforts now to look at how grazing might change habitat and improve habitat for the butterfly native species. That being said, there are of course, some native shrubs that may not, always benefit from certain types of grazing treatments. So this is the Palade manzanita. It's in the Bay Area, and there's a couple documented cases where it's been extirpated by a sort of creation of fuel breaks. So, we don't obviously want brush in a fuel break that's working well, and so this is, you could say, a victim of that sort of treatment. So, it's really understanding what your goal is and what's there and what might be impacted by it. Often people wonder, well, why can't we just, have more of our native herbivores come back? Why can't they do it? They used to do it. Well, the system's changed a lot. But the other reason is because we can't really manage them the same way we can manage our domestic livestock. So that's true of numbers and of location. And, it's not like we're finely tuning, managing each animal that's out there, but these animals we really do not have much control over. And nor would I think people want us to be controlling them to that level. So another impact of grazing is changing ecosystem function. And one really clear example is the creation of livestock ponds, which has occurred throughout our landscapes in order to provide water for livestock, and also in terms of sediment traps, but also now important habitat for at least 3 special status species through much of California. And these ponds are still maintained by ranchers for livestock water. So that's one example of a function where you have actually the rancher themselves impacting the function. But there's also the example of our vernal pools, which Billy spoke about, and how the livestock grazing helps to maintain the flora around the pools. But also it does that by maintaining in part the inundation period. So you have it's not entirely clear what all the mechanisms are. It clearly includes some compaction occurring by livestock walking on wet soils around vernal pools, but also by removing the biomass so that the pools who are filling from surface flow water maintain a long enough inundation period to support the species like the tiger salamander up there in that picture next to a hoof print. Another way that livestock might change function for an ecosystem is in reducing the fuel loads and therefore reducing the intensity of fire. So this is a fire down in Southern California after the next growing season, and you might notice it's still a pretty stark landscape, meaning nothing grew after that, at least after that first year, which is an indication, I think, of a really hot fire. And so then the question might be, would we have a different impact if we had had grazing on the site first and then had fire? Would it have been a cooler fire, and then we would have had regrowth and regeneration sooner? Often what is one concern is what is livestock's impact in terms of erosion, and is this something that we might be we should be concerned about? There's some new research that was just published in 2018. Modeled soil erosion potential is low across California's annual rangelands, and it's low where residual dry matter is maintained under recommended levels. So that's the levels of how much forage is left on the ground following the growing season prior to our fall rains. So when we follow the guidelines, and these are guidelines that have been promoted by UC Cooperative Extension and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they are guidelines that not only protect the soil from erosion, but also help to optimize sort of forage production the next year. When these are maintained, then we see low levels of erosion. Ecosystem structure, so that sort of goes along with species composition. So in this example, we see a different structure created on one side of the fence than the other, from livestock grazing brush versus grass. It's clear that without grazing, we have tall plants, like in many places, like this field of avena, wild oats. And some of our species, like the San Joaquin kit fox, really benefit from having low structure. So this is in the San Joaquin Valley, and as well as some of our plants, which even prefer even some spots of bare ground. So all those can be created with livestock grazing managing structure. So the final point I want to cover is that livestock impacts can be managed to achieve resource management objectives and minimize negative impacts. And this is done with grazing management, which includes thinking about your herbivore selection, your timing, your intensity, and there's some tools and infrastructure that can help manage those. And the selection of herbivore was already discussed. I'm lacking a goat and a horse and probably a few other animals up there. But considerations include knowing what your goals are, the history of the site can even help. And then infrastructure. Infrastructure might have a lot to do with what you're able to do in terms of water, fencing, access. Why are there differences? Well, there's clearly a difference in size of animals. There's difference in the size of their digestive system, which has to do then with what they might be able to consume. They have different mouth anatomies and different behaviors. They socialize different. They have different experience and management. But I want to remark that it's not just about the species, but also within the species, the classes of animals. And Andrea provided some examples of that, of young animals versus old animals. We can get really, though, hung up on thinking that, you know, oh, what's the perfect species for this situation? And there's definitely overlap. So we have goats that can eat grass, and we have cattle that can eat ivy or thistles or whatever. And so really having managers who understand how they can manage their animals to achieve specific objectives. And it's not always that fine-tuned that you can be that precise about it, I would say. But there are definitely some goals that can be achieved through herbivore selection. Some of the goals that you might consider are controlling non-native grass and minimizing the impact on native forests. So that might be best achieved by one species or another, controlling woody plants, depending on the woody plants. Preventing brush from encroaching into a grassland where you have a lot of native forests and grasses might be another example where herbivore selection comes into play. In terms of timing, our grass is growing and our vegetation is growing at different times of year, and so how the animals graze it is going to be different. What value it is to them is going to be different. What they select is different. And so being aware of the seasonal changes, and you know, we pretty much know in our system, we don't know exactly generally when we're going to get our fall rains, but we kind of know we have this wet period as a Mediterranean climate in the winter and the dry summer period. And so understanding that and how that fits with our livestock production system is really important. And you see our ranchers still practicing, if you would, some form of this like transhumance. In fact, in the Bay Area, I've been looking at data, and about 70% of our livestock that are going to be sold, so this isn't the cow herd, but the calves and so forth, leave the Bay Area in 2 months, all in May and June. And that's definitely relative to the forage production and quality. So, you know, working with that makes a lot of sense. So when to graze, also, you have to consider the goals, the history, the infrastructure. And there's a lot of sometimes misperceptions, like you can't graze. I've heard people say, well, we can't graze, the flowers are blooming. Well, we have cattle in that picture there, and there's Nacella pulchra, our state needle grass there, as doing well as our native forbs. And the cattle are actually selecting the non-native grasses at that time of year in that photo. In the other photo, it was brought up, the example Mark brought up of having unintentional impacts on oaks, and there's ways to manage that. So in this case, it was protecting the oaks so that you could still have grazing, and that was done with and it's not even always just cattle or sheep or goats that it needs to be protected from, but often there's other herbivores out there that you might need to protect certain plants you want from. So examples of this are reducing annual grass biomass is where timing might come into place. Controlling yellow star thistle, that might be a different time of year, and increasing native forb cover. Intensity, so how many and how long. So that can be controlled by fencing and when they're put in and when they're put out. But I wanted to share with you this sort of graphic that I think really shows really well something to think about, and that is that we can have the same carrying capacity and or stocking rate and have a much different impact in terms of intensity. So in both of these cases, we have 100 animal days per acre. So we can put in one animal for 100 days or 100 animals for 1 day, and that's the same rate. It has different impacts, of course. So in the one case where you have the one animal, they don't have to be, they're going to be very selective about what they're choosing. When you put in 100 animals for 1 day, they're going to be they're not going to be very selective because they're all sort of fighting to get a bite. Something to think about though is the level of management that significantly changes, and the attention that must be. I mean, think about if we go 1 day over where we have one animal for 100 days and it goes to 101 days, not that big of a deal. Even we could go 102, 103, maybe even 105 days. Still not much impact. But on the other hand, 1 more day, we've doubled our impact. So just something to think about. It's a higher level of responsibility in terms of attention and what the impact might be. But I also want to bring up that it's not just sort of this idea that we have to have, you know, fencing. We can also achieve intensity by some of our other range management techniques, including where we have water. So we know water is an attractant. It impacts distribution of livestock, and distribution means also intensity. So, you know, in some cases we might be able to think about where our attractants are on the landscape and how that then influences intensity. And I think people should also always remember that there's herding as a way to manage livestock and impact intensity. And when there was a study done by one of my colleagues looking at what improved riparian health, and when she went out and interviewed ranchers, she found that, you know, the time they spent herding in riparian areas did have impact on riparian health. And I think it was a bit of a surprise that that was even occurring in that situation. So examples real quick of goals that influence intensity might be reducing annual biomass. You might see that there's a reoccurring goal. So some of them can be impacted by intensity and timing and even selection of herbivore. Favor native perennial grass seedling survival. Create diverse vegetation structure. You might notice that I haven't talked about grazing systems at all really yet. But it is a way in which we can implement a grazing strategy. So a grazing system can help us control the timing, intensity, and the herbivore selection. It should be done with a grazing plan, a grazing system, and then a monitoring program. So by grazing systems, I mean things like continuous year-round, season, long grazing, rotational grazing, high intensity, short duration grazing. These are all grazing systems. And choosing the right grazing system is just going to depend on, you know, what are the goals? What's the grazing strategy? What sort of intensity and timing are you after? And I gave you a good example of where time and cost might come into play if you're trying to do something that's more intensive. You also need to consider the facilities. It's amazing how many, oftentimes I'm working with public agencies that decide they want to have a new grazing system, but they haven't recognized that that requires infrastructure like fencing and water to make it work, as well as, experience. And finally, any system we put in should be monitored. And I would argue that our monitoring sometimes now has gone, we either have none of it or we seem to go overboard, I think, in many cases. But using observations and common sense, I think, are really important places to start. And I think there are some good targets that we can use, and to really ask yourself before you start collecting data, what you're looking at it for, what it's going to tell you about your program, and making sure that you spend time picking the right thing to monitor. In closing, I kind of want to come back to what I started with, that is, we are really have these valuable working rangelands in California that are a primary land use, and I think we need to remember that they are currently providing value in terms of biofuels management, and also now we're seeing it in terms of habitat management. And we need to begin to think about, how are they going to continue to exist on the landscape? Because I think in some places they are at risk. They're at risk from a population that really just doesn't understand and thinks that maybe it cannot be all replaced with faux meat. And ultimately, I think there is a much bigger role for livestock grazing to reduce our fuel loads, and maybe not reduce numbers of fires or even the acreage that's burned, but I think clearly at least the intensity in which our fires are, and that seems like there's some real win-win there in terms of habitat and biofuels management.
Thank you.